the recording now. So welcome everybody to today's Research Data Management Essentials training course. It's an hour and a half. We will aim to take a 5-minute break about halfway through. My name's Rachel and I'll be presenting today with my colleague Nick. And we both work in the research data team based in the library. Used to be based in Edward Boyle Library, and we are both here on campus in the library at the minute, but we quite often deliver our training and other services from home. But we're very contactable by email, and we'll be sharing all our contact details at the end of this session. The slides from today are available in Minerva, so you will be able to go back and have a look at the slides if you need to. Similarly, you'll get an email to tell you where the recording of the session is. So again, if you want to go back to it, or if you've missed any bits of it, or you drop out, then you'll be able to go back and have a look should you wish to. The format of today's webinar, we'll start with a short introduction to some of the supporting materials in Minerva or Blackboard. The main thrust of the session really is to introduce the idea of a data management plan. Now, from your descriptions in the chat, it seems like most of you are PGRs, postgraduate researchers doing a PhD. So it's well worth being aware that if you are a PGR and you registered from September 2019 onwards, there is an expectation that you write a data management plan for your PhD and discuss it with your supervisor, and we'll be coming on to that. We'll suggest some of the issues that you might like to consider about research data. We will introduce the idea of metadata and documentation. So this is creating descriptions of your data and documenting what you do. It's probably stuff that you already do. None of these ideas that we'll introduce today, very few of them are going to be new, but if there is any jargon or anything you want us to just go over again or explain again, please do put your hand up or write in the chat. But really, this is stuff that you've been doing probably for years anyway, and we're just encouraging you to do stuff well and get into good habits. Towards the end of the session, we'll explain what data repositories are and go through some of the options for sharing data outside your immediate project team. And at the end, we have some links to more information, training and support, some suggested exercises. Mainly it's the material that's in the Minerva area. And as I say, there will be regular stops for questions as we go along. We're going to kick off with a short exercise, and for that exercise we're going to use a platform called Menti, which some of you may have used before. You can use this on your phone, or you can use it on your laptop or whatever device you're viewing the webinar on. And you have a choice. You can either click on the link that Nick has put into the chat, or you can type in www.menti.com, and when it asks you for the code, type in 94112665. So www.menti.com and then type in the code 94112665. What you should see is a screen that says, when we say data, what 3 words come to mind? So just type in, when you hear data, what does it make you think of in your field? There's no right or wrong answer to this. And hopefully, if it all goes well, Nick will be able to share his screen and we'll see what the responses are that are coming through. Are you getting some responses, Nick?
Just bear with me, I'm trying to remember how to share. It won't be a moment.
We're not quite with it today. We'll get there.
Can you see that?
Yes, that's looking good. So we've had 6 responses so far, and there's 20 odd people in the room, so I think there's people still probably typing in their responses. They'll gradually appear as you type your responses in. So welcome to those of you who, I can see that some of you are still joining the session, so welcome to those of you who are sort of late joiners. Just to remind you that we've started recording the session. The recording will be available afterwards, so will the slides. And we're inviting everybody as the session goes along this morning to type into the chat box or to raise a hand if you've got a particular question that you would like to ask. Can you see? Yes, good. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing on your screen, instead of the slides, it's the responses from the Menti poll that you're filling in. So this is what you're typing in when you think of data. Again, if you've just joined the session, you can go to www.menti.com and use the code 94112665, or you can click on the link that Nick has posted into the chat, and that will take you there. I'll just repost that in case anybody's just joined the session. And thank you. I can see all your responses coming in. So we've had a few responses. Information's coming quite highly. Looks like a few of you are saying information. I can see we've got qualitative data, Excel, so it could be particular packages or ways that you're gathering your data. It could be words, yeah. But I can see some reactions to data. So you've got overwork and frustration as well. Oh dear.
Sure that wasn't you, Rachel?
No, it definitely wasn't me. Surveys. So surveys, yeah, again, you could be gathering data online. Could be interviews, could be face-to-face interviews, for example. Quantitative and qualitative data, both mentioned here, aren't they? Spreadsheets, numbers, yeah. Interpretation, how you interpret your data. Recordings, facts. What else have we got? Panic. Oh dear. There's quite a few. Perhaps you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed maybe by some of the data collection or data analysis. If any of you feel that you want to come onto the microphone and have a chat about that as we go along, then feel free. Hopefully at least having a data management plan can help you structure your thinking about data. That might help. It's definitely not the whole solution, but seek support from us in the data team, your supervisors, your colleagues. See if there's any networks maybe that you can plug into of colleagues who are, for example, also dealing with data, who might be able to provide you with some peer support. Well, I can see that we've had 24 responses, and it's going quite small now on the screen.
Yeah. So I'll stop
can't see all the responses.
I'll stop sharing that now then, Rachel.
I can see somebody's put confidential information as well. And again, this is something that we're going to be coming on to. Brilliant. So yeah, you've covered loads of different elements there of data. Thank you for that. We'll just reshare. I'll share the slides again, Nick, so I'll share that. Hang on one second. We'll just go back to the slides. Brilliant. So thanks very much for that. And as you can see, you've got quite a diverse group of words there around data. And as I say, there is no right or wrong answer to what data is. It'll be very, very different for each of you, depending upon your subject area and also the type of research and project that you're doing. When you were invited to join the session today, you may have spotted in the email that there is some supporting material in Minerva. And hopefully some of you may have had a chance to have a look at that. It can be quite useful to review the material before the session because it can prompt some questions. But if you haven't, don't worry. It's also useful to go back to those materials in Minerva after the session as part of your consolidation. Briefly, when you go to Minerva, at the top of the screen, there are 3 modules. The first module is kind of what you've just done. It's asking you to think about what data you yourself are going to be using in your research. Now, this could be data that you're generating yourself, or it could be data that you're sourcing from a third party, so somebody else's data that you're reusing, or it could be a combination of the two. It could be digital data. In many cases it will be, but equally it could be physical data depending upon your field. And again, module 1, it outlines the data management expectations from the University of Leeds and research funders. So again, in that module, there's a link out to the university's data management policy. And perhaps the key thing to be aware of is it's great that you're here today, because one of the key strands of that is that you should have a data management plan for your project, and that applies to PGRs as well as staff. Also, to be aware that if you are applying for funding in the future, you'll quite often see that research funders have expectations about research data and open science in general, or open research, and you may have to submit a data management plan to a funder if you're applying for a grant. We also introduced the idea of a data life cycle, and that is something that we're going to be coming back to as we go through the session today. In the second module, this is more of a kind of housekeeping information where, again, this is stuff that you'll have been doing for quite some time, and some of you will already be really good at this, organising a large volume of material. But as you're doing a PhD, you will be generating quite a significant volume of material. It could be quite diverse, and you'll be managing it over a period of years. So it's worth putting in a bit of thought right at the beginning to make sure that your material's well organised. That could be adopting a standard file naming convention, making sure that you have a folder structure that makes sense, and documenting that. So actually writing down your process so that when you come back to your materials in 2 or 3 years' time, you'll still understand what you have and where your material is. You should also think about how sensitive the material is that you're generating, and make sure that you're aware of all the storage options at the university and that your data is stored appropriately, depending upon how sensitive it is, for example. As you're going along through your processing, always document what you're doing, create good records for yourself. Because as well organized as something might be, data is only useful if when you come back to it, you can actually understand what it is, and that, for example, any decisions that you've made about your data, processing decisions, etc., have been documented. So document as you go along. Then finally, module 3, and we'll be picking this up in the session this morning, you might find that you want to share some of your data outside your immediate project team. So you need to think about whether it's suitable for sharing, but also be aware of some of the ways that you can share your materials. This module gives you an example of a data set in the University of Leeds Research Data Repository. Now that's a service that we manage here in the library. It is available to you. And it's worth having a look at that module, I think, to give you an example of a data set. And what you'll see is how the author has associated that data set with a published paper in a journal. And we'll be recapping on this later on this morning. Then finally, in that third module, we introduce the idea of persistent identifiers. And 2 key persistent identifiers that you need to be aware of as researchers are, first of all, digital object identifiers, or DOIs. You'll almost certainly have seen DOIs on journal articles and other online content. This is a permanent and persistent identifier that usually appears in the form of a clickable link, and it always takes you to that journal article or associated material wherever it is on the web. So that's why it's a permanent and persistent identifier. If you deposit data with us in the Research Data Leeds repository, we will give you a digital object identifier for your work. The second identifier to be aware of, and again we'll be coming back to this, is the ORCID. Now that is a personal persistent identifier for you as an individual researcher. It's free to get, and we recommend that all researchers obtain an ORCID. So feel free to go back to that material anytime to sort of refresh yourselves after the end of the session today. It's hopefully worth having a look at. If you have any feedback on the materials in Minerva, again, we're always happy to hear from you. If there's something missing that you'd find useful, let us know. Or if you've seen useful supporting materials yourself online, again, let us know. Now, one of the key things that we introduce in those 3 modules and that we'll be talking about today is the data lifecycle approach. Now, this is just encouraging you to really think ahead when you're generating your data. The diagram is based on the UK Data Archive data lifecycle. It has multiple steps. There are lots of different sorts of life cycles available. And actually, you know, life's not always as straightforward as this life cycle would imply. But basically, it's saying that for any project, it's always a good idea to have a plan, which you have at the top. So I think somebody mentioned interviews in the Menti poll. Imagine you're doing some interviewing, you'd have to think about how to collate and collect that data consistently and what format that's going to be in. So for example, you might be doing audio recordings, you might be doing transcriptions. You might perform some processing on that data, like marking up a transcript from interviews. You might do analysis to try and find sort of sentiment or views, or just analyze the text that you have from your interviews. And all these steps need to be carefully documented. And as you move around the life cycle, you may come to a point where you've gathered lots of data, you've done some analysis, you've got some really interesting results, but you're going to have to make some decisions about how long you keep the raw data for, or whether you destroy it, and also whether there are any elements of the data that you've generated that you could share with others so that they can then reuse it. Now, by the time you've got round to this part of the life cycle, sometimes researchers find that they, at the beginning, used some unfortunate wording, for example, in consent, or that they didn't get the agreements that they needed. And it can cause a few headaches further down the line if you haven't sort of thought ahead to all the things that you want to do with your data. So the idea of a life cycle is to just keep thinking ahead, keep thinking around the life cycle. And that if you do that, potentially it can head off some problems later down the road. So we offer this to you as one model, but you can choose any life cycle model that speaks to you or that's relevant to your research. It's really the key takeaway is to plan and also think a few steps ahead and document each of the key stages in the life cycle. Now, before we move on, has that prompted any questions or comments? Has anything come in the chat, Nick, that you've spotted at all?
No, not at the moment. Although Karen was tweeting that it was useful. I noticed. I'm always on Twitter as well, as you know. So thanks for your tweet, Karen. You can come again.
Yeah, so at any time you can either type into the chat box or raise your hand, and we can have a chat online. But the next, actually, I think we will do the poll, Nick, if you don't mind. So Karen, this is a very timely comment that you've just made. One thing I've just mentioned is the data management plan. Now, there are various different formats and templates available to write a data management plan. We have one at the University of Leeds that we offer to you that you can use if you would like to. You don't have to, but it's a good starting point. It's a template that we've put together based on lots of other different templates from funders, for example. And you find that when you look at lots of data management plans, they tend to cover the same areas. So just a quick poll.
I'm working on it. I'm doing it.
You're working on it. So there is a copy of the data management plan linked from Minerva, and it's on the university website. And again, there's no right or wrong answer to this. Don't worry if you haven't. So have you actually seen and downloaded the data management plan template from the university? Ibtis says no in the chat. That's fine. Okay. So just fill in the poll. I can see the responses coming in. We're going to share the link in a second anyway, so do not panic if you haven't seen this. Yeah, so the responses have come in. There's still one or two of you to respond, but that's fine. I think we'll share the responses in 1 second. So Bao, you're a yes. That's excellent. Well done. Okay, I'm going to show you the responses.
Oh, sorry, I pressed it at the same time.
That's okay. So we've got quite a few of you who haven't and a few who have. This is sort of almost a 50-50 split. So if you have, it would be useful to have a copy of the template in front of you that you might want to refer to. But Nick has pasted a link into the chat where you can hopefully click on that and have a look at the template. And I'm going to walk you through the template in any case. So even if you don't have it in front of you, that's absolutely fine. One of the things we've said here is a data management plan, really, it's what you make of it. So we'd suggest that you kind of wrap it into your project documentation, that it's something that you come back to on a regular basis, and that you update it as things change, as they inevitably will do over the course of a project. So update it regularly, but we've also used the word there, proportionate. So for some of you, if you're generating a fairly modest amount of data, perhaps it's not too complex, maybe you're working either in a small team or on your own, you might have a fairly modest document that's mainly for your own use. For others of you, you may well be part of a large project team. For some of you, you might be part of, for example, an international project. And in this kind of case, you might have a much more substantial data management plan, and it might be a document that you use across multiple people. Again, the answer, there's no right or wrong answer, it's whatever suits you in terms of your own research and your own role in that research. The main thing is to have some form of data management plan. The template that we've written is a multi-part template. It's like it's two pages. You have the sections of the template itself, but we've suggested some kind of questions or bullet points for each of the sections. Briefly then, we have 10 sections. I'll just, apologies, navigate to my notes. So section 1, again, you've already started this, which is just considering what data you're going to produce, either yourself or used from other sources. And it's really important, can't really stress enough, if you are using data from other sources, always fully track where you got your data from. So that you know exactly what you have, but also, for example, any permissions or restrictions that apply to that data. The template that we've put together also at the top has kind of a table for key metadata or information about the plan itself. So it's a good idea, again, to record some basic details about your project. And you might also have a versioning table. So, for example, if you're going to revisit this plan during your supervision meetings, if you're a PGR, or during your review meetings, you might have versions that you record in the table at the top of the document. So section 1 is about data. Section 2, where will your data be stored? So think about how to organize your data well. How is it going to be structured? What types of files are you going to use? What sorts of formats? Is there anything special that you need to consider? Like if you're using absolutely enormous volumes of data, do you have sufficient storage for that data? And again, try and think ahead so that you're not you don't face issues at the same time that you need to deal with them, that you kind of plan ahead for anything that might impact on your data gathering or data storage. Section 3 asks you about data access during the project. So who needs access to that data? Is it just yourself and your supervisor? Is it somebody else? Are you part of a project? And how is that going to work? Is it something that you need to use university infrastructure for? Section 4 is about ethics and legal compliance. For some of you, that will be very significant. I noticed somebody from the medical faculty, for example, but it can be from any faculty really, where you might have ethical and legal considerations. And what we would say, we're going to come onto ethics shortly, but again, do think about ethics in the context of your data management plan and make sure that you've looked at both documents together. Section 5 is about documentation, and as I've already mentioned, it's a good idea to document what you're doing and describe as you go along. And much easier to do this sort of thing at the time than try and remember what you did, even a month later, let alone a year or two later. Section 6, again, it's a good idea to have a think about what training needs you had, and you could use this, for those of you who are PGRs, in conjunction with writing your training plan. Are there any data-related training courses that you need to go on? Think about that data life cycle. So there could be training at any point in that data life cycle, from before you start to gather the data, to how you manage or organize the data, to data analysis, data visualization, data sharing, and again, use that to plan ahead for your own training and support requirements. Section 7 asks you to think about data sharing beyond the end of your project. So this overlaps with the repository information that we're going to give to you at the end of the session today. Section 8 is about intellectual property. This is about thinking, are there any rights in the material that you're using and sharing? And again, this can be particularly important if you're sourcing data from somebody else or from another organization. For some of you, and I noticed there's a few engineers, this would be the point to think about, are you likely to produce something where you'll need to apply for a patent, for example? So if you've created an invention or something where you'll need some intellectual property support or protection. And also thinking about whether you might have produced something where there's commercial potential. So these would be reasons why you might not immediately share the materials that you've generated. And there are particular sections in the university that can help you plan your intellectual property and think about commercial exploitation. So if in doubt, seek advice. You can always come to us, but there's lots of other areas of support around the university. The penultimate section, section 9, is about roles and responsibilities. And again, this is particularly key if you're part of a larger team, where don't assume what roles and responsibilities people will take. It's a good idea to be really concrete and to spell those out and make sure that everybody's clear about what their data-related roles are. And then finally, section 10 is about data curation. And this is a section that you quite often find is missing from other templates. It's encouraging you to think about longer term life of your data. So this might even be after you've left the university. In fact, we've put an end of project table in the template to encourage you to, if you've got materials that are of value, think about what you're going to do with them. How will they live on? Will they be deposited somewhere? Will they be handed over to a supervisor? Just really, again, thinking ahead. So those are the main sections of the plan. And we'd recommend that you start to write that for your project sooner rather than later, if you haven't already. If you've already started writing your plan, maybe share your experience in the chat. That would be great. Now, to illustrate this, we're going to use an example of a project about a robot arm, and we're going to use a plan that they wrote for this project. And I'm going to hand over to Nick, who's going to explain about that. Nick, are you there?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, so as Rachel says, she's been talking to you about the basic plan that we use at Leeds, but that's just one example of a template. So what we're going to show you here, you have access again through Minerva, but I'm just going to post the link again. I'm hoping this will work. Let me know if not, because we've had a bit of fun with this link as well, but hopefully that link will work. It doesn't matter too much, it's just to have it in front of you if you'd like to look at it. So this is quite a nice example, although it is a different template. So you'll see it's only got 7 sections, for example, rather than the 10 that we were just looking at in our basic plan. But it's quite a nice example of a project that was a collaboration between mechanical engineering and medicine, which was aiming to develop robotic aids for rehabilitation and to test their effectiveness on human subjects with real medical conditions or injuries. So it's got a wide range of sort of different data and supported files in different formats, which is one of the reasons we use it. It's quite a nice example. You know, they include things like design files, software, data collected during tests, interviews and images, so qualitative data, and also the equipment and laboratory settings. So, you know, one of the things we're always conscious of with these sessions is that we have a wide range of academic colleagues from different disciplines, and, you know, you'll all have different requirements. So this is quite a nice example that sort of shows some of the different issues across different types of data. There was also a website included in this project for reports and events, and that's something else to think about. You know, if you do have a website, you know, how do you actually make sure that's available in perpetuity and everything that's on the website is saved? So it's all about, you know, preservation, and it's a big aspect of this as well, to make sure that just because it's on a website doesn't mean it's safe in the long term. So that's something else to bear in mind. Now, this plan doesn't actually say a great deal about storage because it had a relatively small volume of data. It was all in one place, but other projects may use multiple storage locations with different storage and security arrangements. You know, if you're working with colleagues from different universities, that kind of thing. So obviously there's limitations to what we can actually cover in one example plan, but I'll lead you through it and show you some of the examples from this one. Now, one of the things with this, I think, that's really worth sort of highlighting is it's not rocket science, it's relatively straightforward, but tables can be useful. So this is what Rachel was saying again at the beginning. You'll be working in ways that is already managing data. So we're not telling you anything you don't know about use of tables, for example. Really useful way, dead straightforward way to provide a summary of the different kinds of data in this example that we created and used in a project. It could include non-digital data as well. So again, depending on your discipline or the area you're working in, you might be working with, I don't know, soil samples or something, or things that are actually non-digital. So again, table, dead easy way to do that. For your specific research requirements, other columns may be needed. You might need storage locations for digital, again, non-digital data, and who's responsible if you have a large team across different disciplines or institutions. But a couple of things to highlight in this example. So I can't remember what the slides show. Hang on. The design files highlights the difference between the live project and the archiving the files for the long term. So this is something that often crops up depending on, again, what sort of specialist software, etc., you may or may not be using in your specific discipline. So in this context, SLDPRT, it's a file format specific to commercial software called SolidWorks, computer-aided design package, a CAD package. So that's going to be the best and most convenient file format for use during the project, so that it can be exchanged with others working on the project with access to that software. However, the long term for exchange with colleagues who don't have access to SolidWorks, and for preservation in the long term for non-proprietary, it would be an IGS file, which is not, as I say, non-proprietary, a more standardized format. So that's not going to be as useful for people actually with access to SolidWorks, but it ensures that things can be preserved in the long term. An exchange between people that don't have access necessarily to the software. The next thing to think about is software development. So often researchers omit to consider software. So again, depending on your discipline, you may or may not be working with software as a valuable output from your project. So the word data can perhaps be a bit narrow in terms of what it means. Again, you might be working with the humanities, and again, there might be different considerations there, what data means in that context. But software is certainly part of the things that you need to be thinking about managing and sharing and openly licensing, and the things that we'll come on to. And it's often essential for validation and reproducibility. So we'll come on to the concept of reproducible research a little later as well, or we'll touch on it today. We do another session on reproducibility, but this is a really important aspect of science that's getting a lot of traction at the moment in terms of people being aware of just how difficult it can be to actually validate results and reproduce them. So actually, sharing your data and software and code is crucial for that. So in this particular project, something called MATLAB, which again, depending on your discipline, you may or may not be familiar with, was used as the software development platform, and the code in that case was stored in the .m format. So this is actually a specific format to MATLAB, but it's also a plain text file. So it means it's human readable and would therefore be straightforward to implement the code in another programming language. But that's another thing to think about. So if you're using software that's proprietary but non-human readable, it might be important to consider that, whereas anybody that can code in this context could reuse the human readable MATLAB code in a different software. The final thing to emphasize in this particular table, in the context of this particular project, is the interviews and the audio files and transcripts. So again, you'll see, rather than seeing interviews as a single data type, the project teams recognise that the original audio recordings would likely cover sensitive topics, and that's obviously going to be a major issue for many, any data involving human participants, but interview data. It may be, relatively easy to identify research participants, especially through the audio recordings, for example. Whereas the anonymised transcripts
of the interview would be more suitable for sharing, subject to appropriate consent by the participants. So this goes back to what Rachel was saying earlier about the data management life cycle. You need to make sure at the outset you get the appropriate permission to actually be able to use that data in the longer term and to share that data. If you haven't got the right permission in place, then you're not going to be able to do that. So that in turn has implications for how the audio files were stored and who was actually given access during the project, and the arrangements for any destruction at the end of the project, again in terms of any consent from participants. So obviously that's captured in that final column, the sensitivity column. So it's quite a nice example, as I say, just that sort of highlights some of the different issues to think about in the different types of software, well, data, software and code, and quantitative data, and the various different issues of sensitivity. So if you think then about metadata in this context, so metadata, it's a technical term that really just means data about data. It's just the type of information you see on a catalogue or anything like that. And in this particular context, the projects recognise the importance of metadata and the documentation for future use, because obviously this isn't just for future users, it's probably possibly even for yourself. If you're anything like me, you write something down or you forget it. So it's important. So you might think you'll remember in 6 months or even a week in some cases. Rachel and I were just struggling after Christmas because we hadn't sort of done this session for a little while. So certainly I struggle to remember things week on week. So it's very important to document for yourself as well as for other users of data. And some of the things that just to highlight in terms of the metadata here, they recognise the importance of planning for the process of annotating the data as it's captured. Having a documented and consistent approach to data collection will help ensure the research team are all collecting data in the same way. So again, it really isn't, as I say, rocket science. It's just making sure that you're coordinated and organised across the research team to make sure you're collecting data to the same standard. And that consistent approach is going to ensure data quality with clear guidance, labelling and protection of participants through transcription and coding. So again, that ties back to your permissions and your data lifecycle. So it's much easier to ensure quality if there's a script or a pro forma to work from. So again, it's just about organisation. From the beginning of the project, they recognise the potential value of their data and that they plan to share the data. So again, really just emphasising that lifecycle aspect and thinking about it early on. So that the data is then shared with the necessary metadata and potentially a data guide or what we call a README, and that's going to make it much easier for others to reuse and cite that data in the future. So this is obviously related to the metadata and documentation section of the training, well, our standard DMP, our basic DMP. So just a quick thing for you to think about now. What types of information, documentation and context will you collect for your data? So we won't go into this in any detail now, but just to bear this in mind as we go on today, and if it sparks any questions for you. What have you found useful to understand in other people's research? Well, I will just pause there, and I don't know if anybody's got any. I can see there's a lot going on in the chat, so I'll just pause and have a drink for a moment.
I was just answering a couple of things, Nick. There was a question about how often to update the data management plan, to which there is no right or wrong answer. It's as often as is as useful to you. If you are a PGR, you'll have your regular annual kind of review with your supervisor. So you need to have a draft of your plan by the time you come to transfer, which is usually at the end of your first year. And then after that, again, if you've got major changes or decisions or changes in direction, or if you're dealing with lots of complex data, you might want to come back to the data management plan on a regular basis, every month or two. Whereas if it's, everything's rumbling along, there's no particular changes in direction, it might be that you just review it after a few months, but it no less than once a year, I would say, and quite often it would be more than that. Then there was a question about storage of data and knowing where to store. I'll just paste something into the chat box. So I think it's worth just highlighting two different sources of information. The first one that I've put there is what's called the University Secretariat, and they manage the information about data protection. And if you go onto that page there, Managing Electronic Data, it explains to you some of the things that we've just been talking about, and Nick's going to say something else in a second about how to classify your data. And there's also a link to an information management guide that maps the sensitivity of the data against storage locations. So for many of you, you'll be using OneDrive to store your data. It may be necessary to have encryption as well, so putting password protection onto the files. In addition to the Secretariat, there's lots of information about storage on the IT website as well. And again, I've just posted a link to the IT website about OneDrive, which again explains to you what OneDrive is, how much space you have, and that's what many of you will be using. And I think also, Ibti, there was a question about how long to retain data for. Again, it depends what sort of data it is. So there may be data that you have to get rid of after a period of time because you no longer, for example, if it's identifiable data where you have permission to keep it from your participants, but you don't need that identifiable data anymore, you know, the purpose for which it was collected has finished, then it may be that you need to destroy that data at that point. Again, listing out your data and thinking about how sensitive they are and when they need to be destroyed can be useful. But the Managing Electronic Information Data link that I've just given you there actually links off to what's called a records retention schedule for the university, and that lists out different types of information and the university's retention schedule. In other words, how long you should keep stuff for. So I hope that helps.
A couple of questions there from Karen. Rachel, she's just, I mean, just to clarify that on that, I mean, OneDrive is essentially synonymous with that is university server, unless you mean sharing it. Do you mean during the live stage of your project? Because you have your own OneDrive. Well, we would recommend using the university OneDrive, I think, would we, Rachel? So I'm not sure if you've got a thought on that.
You should use the university's OneDrive. Basically, don't use anything for storing data that's not supported by the university. For example, if you store data on a laptop, you need to make sure that the laptop is encrypted to the university standard. There is information and advice on the IT website about that, and they can provide you with more advice on that. So
5 terabytes, isn't it, I think?
Yeah, 5 terabytes you get on OneDrive. It's going to be sufficient for most purposes. And it means that it's fully backed up and supported by the university. If you look at the Managing Electronic Data Guide, the key is to decide how confidential your data is. So if it's truly anonymous and there's literally no identifying information in there at all, and it's stored separately from any identifying information, then it may be that you don't need any additional encryption, that you could just store it on OneDrive. If it is more sensitive and there's identifying information, then you may need to apply password protection. Again, it's explained on the website. So again, for most of you, if it's truly anonymized and it's not highly confidential, storing it on OneDrive in most cases, University OneDrive, is going to do the job for you.
We're just going to come on actually to handling sensitive or confidential data, aren't we, Rachel? So we'll talk about it a bit more.
Thank you, Simon, for the comment there in the chat. So Simon's found the information on the IT website quite clear about what data, where stuff can be kept and what needs to be encrypted. Thanks, Simon.
And there's just a question there from Andrew in terms of what it means to keep stuff separately. I mean, that is a good question, is it? In terms of, I mean, basically, you don't want to be able to link up the key, for example, with the data. But in practical terms, I'm sure if you could comment on that, Rachel, again, in terms of what that would mean, because obviously, if you had it in a different folder on your own OneDrive, that's potentially.
Yeah, it might be, for example, that you put, if there's identifying information, it can be on OneDrive, so effectively it's in the same location, but it may be passworded. you know, so that there's a high level of encryption, so that even if somebody could access your OneDrive folder with the anonymized data, that they can't access the data with the folder with the identifiable data in it.
Yeah.
Be careful about synchronization, Zainab. It's okay to synchronize, again, if it's not highly confidential data. If it's highly confidential, and again, the information on the Secretariat website and IT website about how to classify your data. I don't know if we've posted the information protection policy at all, Nick.
Not yet.
Yeah, so we'll be posting that in a second, everybody, and that will help you sort of classify your data. So if it's highly confidential, make sure that you're not synchronizing to a local laptop. Anything else, synchronization is absolutely fine.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. So, I mean, yeah, you know, obviously we're seeing this already with some of the questions that come through, but really the point that we're making about a data management plan is, you know, it can feel like an overhead, but it'll almost certainly save your time and effort in the long term, and make sure that you've considered all of these options. I mean, that's the point of a data management plan, to make sure that you're actually considering these as you go. And also, we want to, you know, a question that came up earlier from Karen. There's a danger of these things being as a sort of bureaucratic exercise, as a sort of, you know, you've done it and it's finished, but it really should be a live document. And there's no policing for that necessarily, but it's just really trying to get you into the habit of thinking about it as a, you know, a live document that's useful for you and that you're using in the context of your particular research and whatever, you know, data issues that may arise throughout your project. We've already touched a little bit on handling sensitive or confidential data. So, and again, you know, any of the issues that come up through this that are relevant to your specific circumstances, please do get in touch afterwards, because, you know, with the best will in the world, it's very difficult to answer these questions specifically for your particular needs. But we're always, you know, we're just on the end of a computer screen these days to speak to you in more detail, and we can help you find the right people to talk to. But again, in the context of your data management plan, you know, the sensitivity of data is first addressed through section 4 of the plan, if you think of ethics and legal compliance, but it's also likely that any sensitivity or risk will have implications for most of the other sections as well. So it really does cut across the entire data management plan in many ways. You know, how it's stored, we've already touched on a little bit, so that's section 2, and how it's shared, 3 and 7. What training's needed, so again, if you've got highly confidential data, you know, and certain types of data will need specialized training to manage. I don't know if anybody's dealing with that level of confidentiality or sensitive data, and also roles and responsibilities. So again, you know, it's doubly important to be particularly clear on whose responsibilities are, what those people's responsibilities are in a team for managing sensitive data, so that nothing gets missed. So that's all going to be influenced by the sensitivity of, and, you know, and the risk inherent in the data. And some of those resources we've already pointed you to on the website can help with that, on the IT website, or our website, you know, on the research data website, but also IT. And again, really just to emphasize, you know, this isn't easy in terms of navigation. We know that, you know, and it's hard enough for us, and we do it day in, day out. So please do come to us, and we'll help you find the answers to any questions you may have. In terms of ethics, consent and partnerships is another one. So again, I don't know if anybody's got any commercial partnerships, for example, but, you know, these are the consents we've already touched on, but it's a really good example, just to reiterate, you know, how decisions made early in a project can have a major impact on what can be done with data at the end of the project. So, you know, that's really why you should have the data life cycle in mind whenever you're making any decisions, and, you know, relate that back to your data management plan. Consent wording is a really good point. We have this all the time, where people have inadvertently restricted how they might use data because of the consent wording. So it's just about, you know, really thinking that through, and in terms of, you know, it doesn't again have to be particularly complex. It's just making sure that you're not using wording that's going to restrict it without, you know, and at that stage you might not be thinking about that later on, but it's important to think at the outset. You know, and if you are working with human participants, then your ethical review process is going to be undertaken early in the project, and that's going to cover consent and participant information. But again, it's very important to make sure that's joined up with your data management, because
They are two different processes, although we as a university and are trying to bring them closer together, but it is easy for them not to be as joined up as they perhaps should be. Industrial or other partnerships is another area where it's good to have the life cycle in mind. So again, you need to make sure you've got the right agreements in place at the start of your project, or it could be difficult to publish research or data, share the data you generate later on. And again, it's one of those things, you might find that everybody's with industrial partners is quite relaxed at the outset of a project, but maybe, I don't know, 2 years down the line, when there's actual patents potentially involved and potential money to be made from an invention, say, or whatever it may be, then suddenly it becomes an issue. So again, it's very important to get that in place early on in the process. We've also highlighted anonymization there, because this is a question we get asked a lot. We don't have the resource or the expertise necessarily to help, and we can help with anonymization, but there's lots of best practice dotted around the university. So again, just rest assured that you're not alone with this stuff, and we can, we've almost certainly encountered someone in the course of our work who can help us with or advise in a particular area. So don't try and do it on your own. Do come to us if you need any help with this stuff. So again, just quickly thinking about ethics in the context of the robot arm data management plan example. So in this case, the team working on this project recognise the importance of the consent wording. So again, we've sort of laboured that point, but it's very important. We see it all the time. For their own use and planning, the sharing the anonymised transcripts. So their chosen wording reflects that. So all they've said is, I agree. Is it there? You can see it highlighted there. I agree for the research data collected from me to be stored and used for future research in a non-identifying form. So it's really that simple, really. But you can see with just not quite giving that as much thought as it is necessary may mean that you then lock down how you can actually share that research in the future. But just a bit of thought at the outset, make sure that's not going to happen. They've also anticipated that even with anonymization, some of the data may require access control, and that some may need to be destroyed. So again, it's not all or nothing. Some of the data may be shared openly, some of it may need to be controlled, and we have facilities at the university to help with that again. So again, treat everything not as a homogeneous lump, but think about how it can be managed in different ways. Potentially share what you can, justify what you can't necessarily share openly. So I think we're going to have a quick break there with Rachel.
Thanks, Nick. So we're going to take a 5-minute comfort break. We'll come back just 1 minute after 11. But there's a task for you during the break, and that is, we've talked a lot about data and some of the sensitivities and so forth. And a question for you: think about the data that you're using in your own research. Would you share the data? And by that we mean sharing it outside your immediate project team. And while you're thinking about that, if it's a yes, you would, put in the chat yes, and then explain why it's a yes. If it's a no,
we're doing a poll, Rachel.
we are doing a poll as well. And if it's a no, put no and write why you wouldn't. Or if it's a maybe, write maybe and say why you're sort of thinking about it. So we'll come back 1 minute past 11, and then we'll go through your answers. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I don't know if Rachel's back. Are you there, Rachel? Yeah. I mean, that is a good point, though. I'll just while I'm waiting for Rachel. I don't know if we talk about the FAIR data principles, but there's also the CARE data principles.
Sorry, Nick, I was talking, I was muted, the usual. So yeah, I was just saying, a couple more seconds to give your responses if you still want to respond to the poll, and then we'll share the responses. But is there something interesting that's come up in the chat, Nick?
Yeah, it was just what Andrea was saying about that. Due to religious beliefs, people don't allow themselves to be recorded, so they need to find creative ways to share the information without recording people. But it just put me in mind of the CARE data principles. I know we haven't talked about the FAIR data principles, but it may be of interest. But I'll just post a link in there because it's something we've been looking at.
Okay, I'll share the responses from the poll. So we have a couple of people who won't share. We have a couple of people who will share, definitely, and then quite a few who've put maybe. Again, no right or wrong answer to that, and maybe is quite a good response in that really you might not know at the moment exactly what you are going to generate, and so again it's something to keep under review. So let's have a think about some of these yes and no answers. I'll just have a look through the chat, what sorts of things people have said. So we have, so Theodore, you're saying yes, it increases visibility and external validity. So again, your approach may be influenced by the type of data that you're using, and so for example, people working in environmental areas, quite often there's a strong culture of open sharing of data. Whereas, for example, if you deal with a lot of personal interview data, that would have different considerations again, where it may not be easy to share. So there might be some material that's a definite no, but you might be able to share some of it. So that's interesting, yes, for visibility and external validity. So it's kind of scientific and impact kind of reasons there. Karen, you're a maybe, depending upon the consent of the people I interview. And again, yeah, that comes back to the wording so that it is flexible enough to do what you would like to do. But sometimes, you know, there's recruitment issues, and if you're dealing with very, very sensitive topics, it may well be appropriate that some or even all of the data you know is destroyed. It really very much depends on the project and the subject matter that you're dealing with. What we'd always suggest is just that you sit back, think about it coolly, and think, well, if I'm publishing a thesis or articles from this, are there any aspects that I could share of this material that I've generated? For example, if I deposit in a closed access repository, so that would mean that somebody would have to register and fill in an agreement before they got access to the data. So although we quite often stress open sharing, it is also possible to share material with some restrictions. And again, this is something for you to think about your own personal context and research. Syed, you're a definite no. You'd use your data for your research purposes and not share it with others. Well, that might be appropriate. Again, it depends what it is. For example, if you were publishing a research paper in a journal, just check the policy of the journal that you're publishing with. Some journals in some areas have a requirement or expectation that you share the data that underpins a published article. So again, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. It depends what sort of data it is and what you're planning to do after your research is finished, for example. IBTI, so based on the purpose of sharing for review or something else. Well, it depends what you're sharing for. It might be that you've published an article or your thesis and you're sharing in that context. It could be that you're sharing within the context of your project. Simon, maybe it depends on the stage of the research. Absolutely. So you might be mid-analysis or mid-publication. Something to be aware of again is whether if you receive funding from a research funder, sometimes they have things to say about when to share. Most are quite understanding that it's perfectly legitimate that you have a period of exclusive access where only you have access to the material to enable you to analyze and publish from that material. But it may be that in the fullness of time, at least some of the data is shared. So this was the interesting comment from Andrea about languages and about the kind of cultural context in which you're gathering and sharing the data. And I think sometimes photographic data as well can have similar sort of considerations. So yeah, this is something that you would absolutely address in your ethical review as part of thinking about your data gathering. And so bake into that or have a think about the methodology for capturing the data, the wording of the consents that you're using with your participants, and whether it's right to either destroy that data or to keep it for posterity, and in what form that's going to exist. So quite complex, but absolutely the right things to be thinking about. So Karen, you said not in your ethics form and consent forms for schools. So again, it may be that things have got too far, but it might be worth just having a look back and examining the exact form of wording in your ethics form and consent, and considering whether that is actually appropriate for your data. It may well be, but it's something just to have a double check what it says. Zaleha, yeah, absolutely. Commercially sensitive data. Sometimes there is you can only have access to the data on the understanding that it's not shared with others and that it's destroyed after you've finished using it. So again, that there are legitimate reasons for not sharing the data if you can't. Okay, so let's just jump on to the next slide, which is, I think you've covered an awful lot of these responses. So thank you very much for all your comments and input in the chat. I think right at the beginning, the first comment we had was kind of about good research practice and about transparency. We know that it's important when somebody looks at a paper that they can interrogate the data underneath that paper if possible, to make sure that the analysis and results tally with the underlying data. So it could be about research practice. It could be that you share data so that other people can build on that data and that they don't necessarily do the similar research again, so avoiding duplication. Sometimes there could be ethical reasons for sharing as well as not sharing. So it might be that this overlaps with the point that Andrea was making about there could be ethical reasons why it's important because something's under threat, say, to try and capture materials and potentially share that data. The universities in the UK go through something called the Research Excellence Framework every few years, and the direction of travel in that exercise is to give more credit for open research. So you may find that, for example, publications have to be openly available to all in order to be submitted to that exercise. And you may also find that, again, there's credit given for good open research practices. So being transparent, sharing data, say. So it's just something we're flagging to you as very much a direction of travel, both from funders, from journals, universities, that it's really worth being aware of and thinking about in some detail in your own context. If you do receive funding from a research funder, maybe have a look at their website and terms and conditions and just check, do they have anything to say about data? So for example, the Environment and Physical Sciences Research Council in the UK, EPSRC, they're really explicit about what they want you to do with data, that it should be shared, that it should be shared in a timely manner, and so on. So have a check and see if there's anything that's relevant for your funder if you receive direct funding. Also, there is a movement towards journals including what's called a data access statement. And you'll see that if you go back to the Minerva materials, the module 3, where we've given an example of a data set, you can see how a data set has been cited in a journal article. And I think as you go along, you'll see more of these data statements appearing in articles. And the data statement is literally the data underpinning this journal is available at this location. Usually that will include a digital object identifier that you can click and go to the data, but sometimes it might be, for example, people have mentioned commercial sensitivity and other reasons why you might be able to share some of the data with controls, like you have to register. So it's saying how you could access that data if you needed to. Sometimes that will be because it's open, you can click and go to it. Other times it's about the steps that you would need to go to in order to access that data. But it is something that you will see more over the next few years. But there are self-interested reasons potentially to share as well. And I think some of you mentioned about publication and impact. So you may find, or there is evidence across a number of different subject areas, that if you publish an article that does have data associated with it that's available, it tends to be more heavily cited than a similar article in the same subject area that doesn't have the data associated. Also, we're aware of people who, research teams have made a data set available. It's generated some interest around it and a community around it. So it can be a way of making an impact, just in the same way that going to a conference or publishing a journal article can make an impact. So there are lots and lots of reasons why you might consider data sharing, but equally, and you've highlighted some of these, there may be legal or ethical reasons why you can't share. It might be that you're in the middle of writing a publication. That's fine, you know, that you hold the data back until you make the publication live. Sometimes researchers are concerned about being scooped, which is similar to the previous point. That's where maybe you've made a data set available, some other research team has come along and, you know, found that all important finding before you have. So in other words, you've been scooped. So again, it's something to think about as an individual researcher and as a team, so that you can have an extra impact by making that data available. But you need to think about, well, are we in the middle of publication? Are there any downsides to making the data available? Previously, we mentioned that there might be intellectual property considerations which would hold back sharing the data. For example, if you're applying for a patent, or if you're planning to commercially exploit the material in some ways. Again, that would be a reason for not sharing. So it's a balance, no right or wrong answer, and it's going to be different for each of you. So I think, Nick, do I hand back about what data you might want to keep of all that lovely mass of data that you've generated during your research?
Yeah, I won't spend too long on this because, but it is a good question that we often get asked, and you know, obviously, depending on the volumes of data, you may be collecting huge volumes of data, and it may not be necessary or appropriate to retain all of that data. So it's not necessarily an easy decision depending on your discipline and, as I say, the amount of data you're collecting. And really, you know, we have to sort of throw this back to you as the experts in your particular subject area. You know, you're far more likely than we are to know what data you would want to have access to. And think about it from when you're reading a research paper. You know, what would you need in order to understand how the data was collected, for example, and what data would you need to actually validate the results of a particular result? So some of the questions that might be relevant, again, depending on your discipline, is, you know, what's irreplaceable or very expensive to repeat? So irreplaceable might be, I don't know, a one-off event. So I don't know, a survey around the Brexit referendum, for example, it's not going to happen again, at least not for a while. Or, you know, a lab type project might be possible to repeat, but it might be very expensive if you need particular, I don't know, commuting resources, that kind of thing. Does your data have value beyond your publication or thesis? That can be a difficult one because you, as a specialist in your area, may think that, you know, it's not going to have any utility to anybody else, but it may well have. And this is a big argument, or a good argument, I think, for open research more generally, and research data sharing, is interdisciplinarity. You know, the fact that others may see a value in your data that you may perhaps not, being a specialist in a particular area. But crucially, you know, as I've already mentioned, what data you need to keep to validate the results of your published research, and that is a growing area of concern, really, in the academy. The fact that there's a lot of evidence that an awful lot of research can't actually be reproduced, even by the original scientists that published that research. You know, so it's very, very important that we try and address that as a sector. And there's actually evidence being submitted to Parliament at the moment around that issue, and there's a couple of interesting reports on that at the moment. If you're interested, I'll try and dig out the links and post them in a moment. So that brings us on to repositories. So, you know, we've been around the full circle now. We've shared, it's time to share our data. We've planned everything, we've worked through our data management plan, we've got all our consent in place, we've got all the documentation that we've stressed throughout. So then it's time to think about how you can share your data, which is section 7 and 10 of the basic data management plan. So some of the considerations here are to consider whether your funder has a preference. So some funders, for example, the Natural Environment Research Council, have their own data centres, so they will expect you to offer any data to them in the first instance to share on your behalf. Or there may be a well-established subject repository. Again, depending on your discipline, there may be a more appropriate specialist repository with different metadata fields and that kind of thing, and the place where people in your discipline are most likely to actually go and look for data. So an example might be the Cambridge Crystallographic Data Centre, CCDC, or GenBank, so gene sequences and that kind of thing would tend to go in GenBank. Or your publisher may have a preference. So increasingly, publishers and specific journals actually work with specific repositories. So Data Dryad or Dryad is one example of a repository that has partnerships with journals in ecology that you may be steered towards, which is fine. Or the re3 data registry is something you can look at. That can be a really useful resource for actually finding data as well in a particular area. If you think about when you're doing a literature review, you can also increasingly start thinking about a data review, actually, what sort of data has been collected in, has there already been data that might help you to answer a particular research question, that kind of thing. And we at Leeds do have our own repository, which is available as a repository as a general repository for anybody affiliated with the University of Leeds, and we can guide you through that as well. So I'll just pause there and ask you if there's any questions about some of those final issues we've raised. We've got a few 10 minutes or so left. We've got a few extra bits to cover, but I'll pause there for a moment to see if there's anything relating to repositories, etc.
Yeah, do feel free to either type in or you can put your hand up and come onto the microphone if you would like to. I was just answering Karen's question in the chat, probably not in the most clear terms.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's the data itself, which might have reasons why you can't share it. But of course, if it's there might be sensitivities about whoever supplied the lifestyle data. So it really does come down to whatever agreement was signed with the third party that supplied the data, and if they've got reputational concerns or whatever it is, again, you need to think about that as part of your ethical review, which you probably already have done. But it might be that you could be, again, depending upon how sensitive it is, really transparent about the steps that you took to analyze the data and share as much as that as possible. And that, again, you may put a statement somewhere about what data was used and how somebody else could access it if they needed to. And that might be like applying to the company that you sourced it from, say. So it's about being transparent and providing people with a recipe or enough steps to kind of recreate what you did, really. Any further questions on anything that we've talked about so far? Nothing coming through. Okay, well, I'll just say a little something about transparent and reproducible research, unless you want to, Nick.
Carry on. It's all right.
Okay.
I'm running out of steam.
Because it's a data session, we've kind of emphasized this morning sharing research data, and we've explained and you've explored yourselves. It can be really different and varied depending upon your discipline. But it is quite important to share the data if you can, but not if it's not appropriate to do so. However, data sits within a kind of a larger landscape of transparent and reproducible research, sometimes called open science, sometimes called open research. And you'll see, again, these phrases used during your career as an academic, almost certainly over the next few years. It's becoming, if anything, it is definitely a growth area. So emphasis on sharing open data, but if you write software, for example, I think there's concern that software is not fully credited, that we want to make sure that it's curated properly, deposited properly, and that you as an author of software get full credit. So again, you can deposit it in a way where you get a permanent identifier for code, and it would allow you somebody to cite that data in the same way that you would a journal article, for example. But also, if you've released that code under an open license, potentially somebody can come along and modify it, distribute it, build on it, etc. So it's something to think about if you use or write code. Similarly, you might share full information about what hardware you used to generate your data, your calibration settings, and so on. Again, it's about being transparent and allowing people to follow in your footsteps and understand what it is you did and how you achieve the results that you did. Open access is something that, again, you've probably almost certainly come across already, that is usually a term used for publication. There is an expectation from some funders that you make your publications freely and availably open online for everybody to read. The alternative is to be in a subscription-based journal where people would need to have a subscription to the journal in order to access your articles. There's lots and lots of information about this on the library website, and if it's something that you're not familiar with, I think it's well worth investing a bit of time to become more familiar with open access publication, so that you understand what your options are. And again, open notebooks, sometimes we have data sets where people have reproduced some of the pages from their laboratory notebooks, for example, as part of contextual documentations. You might work in a really open way. You can't do that if you're in a very sensitive area or if you're working with commercially sensitive stuff, but it's something to consider. If you're in an arts field, it could even be something like your working sketchbook, that illustrates your ideas. It could be all sorts of things. It will depend. So it is about being open, transparent, and potentially reproducible. Now, in this context, we have a series of, we haven't updated the slide.
Yeah, that's an old one. It's all right. There's actually a recording of that event on the blog. I've just posted. We've run lots of these events in this these links there. We do actually have a couple coming up. I'll post the links to those now.
Thank you, Nick.
Sorry.
So we run, they're usually every month or 6 weeks or so. In a lunchtime slot, we'll have usually an external speaker, sometimes an internal and external, but they're always an interesting topic around open research. This particular one was last year, but Nick's posted 2 forthcoming ones that are coming up. What are the ones that we've got coming up this month and next month?
Well, the next one's actually next week, and this is actually on open education, but that's it does cross over. So that's called Digital and Open Education for Inclusive Societies. But the whole open movement is a broad church at the moment. The other one that is more specific to some of the things we've just been talking about in terms of open research is a really interesting new platform called Octopus that's generating a lot of excitement at the moment, and we're hearing from the inventor of that platform on the 15th of February. Now, these events are open to everybody. They will be recorded if you can't make them, but you can sign up at those links on Eventbrite. That one on Octopus in particular will explain some of the issues with the current models around scholarly communication and publishing, and how the sector is trying to address some of these issues that we just touched on there. So that should be an interesting one. So please do come along or catch the recording if you can't.
Thanks, Nick. So I'm going to turn off the recording shortly, just to finish off, to say, if you're thinking about your next steps, as we mentioned earlier, the slides are available to you, and there are various additional materials in Minerva. There's some follow-on exercises if you want to do more. There's some links to other resources, videos, and so forth. So do have a look and see if there's something useful for you there in Minerva. We just recommend that if you haven't already, that you start to write your data management plan. You don't need to send them to us or anything like that. It's really a record for you to use for your own purposes. If you are a PGR, you should share it with your supervisor, but use it in the way that's most useful for you. I think we've tried to stress throughout the session, keep good records as you go along, get into good habits. And it can be really tempting to think short term, but do try and think longer term about your data and what your plans are. So I'm going to open the mic in a second. If you need to contact us after this session, the best way really is to just email researchdatainquiries@leeds.ac.uk. And if you have any follow-up questions, we'd be very happy to take those from you. I'm going to stop the recording in a second, and then if anybody's been waiting to come onto the mic, you'll be able to. So thanks very much. I'm stopping the recording now.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And I know you